thank you for joining us on Day Trip to Wine Country, presented by Citi. I'm Sam Kimball from New York Wine Events, and today we are going to the Dry Creek Valley, AVA, American Viticultural Area, which is in Sonoma County, California. Dry Creek is an interesting place, and you can see it in my background here. Or actually, this is a sub-AVA within Dry Creek called Rockpile. Dry Creek encompasses a total of 60,000 plus acres of land, with 9,000 of that acreage planted with vineyards. And the appellation really benefits from its proximity to Lake Sonoma Reservoir, which is great for the irrigation part of the process in a very relatively dry area. And in Dry Creek AVA, Dry Creek Valley AVA, there's 60 plus wineries and over 100 plus wines that bear the Dry Creek Valley AVA designation on the bottle label. So a lot of wine, a lot of great wine coming out of this area. The Dry Creek AVA, Dry Creek Valley AVA rather, is home to the majority of the Sonoma vineyards that belong to E&J Gallo Winery, the famous Gallo wines. And they established winery facilities in the valley in the early 1990s. But where we're headed today is a smaller but no less prestigious winery with a well-earned reputation, Mauritson Wines, located in Healdsburg, California. Morrison is an awesome winery. They make wines. They specialize in making wines in that sub-AVA Rockpile, and that's a sub-American viticultural area within the Dry Creek Valley. Their wines are really spectacular. To learn all about Morrison, you can visit morrisonwines.com. I will put that URL up on the screen in my background now. And I want to point out a great opportunity to get the wines we're showcasing in this session. So here is the URL. It's Mauritson Wines. And if you can see that entire URL there, there's an offer when you go to that specific spot on their website. It's 10% discount on the wines we're tasting. Plus, this is awesome. I love these flat rate ground shipping offers. $10 flat rate shipping on 3 bottles or more. Just use the coupon code NYWE, stands for New York Wine Events. So we're really thrilled to have such a prestigious winery as our guest and where we're featuring tonight. I want to welcome everybody. Thank you guys for tuning in. It's our second visit to the Sonoma County area this week. Feel free to ask any questions you have along the way. We will answer as many of them. We usually get to all of them during the discussion. So we'll do those in real time as we go. And if you would, jump on the chat right now and let us know where you are logging in from. We love to hear from people and from all over the country. So let us know what part of the great USA you are logging in from tonight. This is our first time working with Morrison, and we're excited. It's really my pleasure and privilege to host the winery founder and 6th generation member of the family that owns and runs the vineyards, Clay Mauritson. Clay, it's awesome to have you on the show. 152 years and counting at Morrison.
I look pretty good, don't I? For 6 generations old, right?
I mean, for 152, you don't look a day over 140.
Say, I was, day over 70. I'll take it. I'll take it. Sam, thank you so much for having me. It really is an honor to be here. I do want to correct one thing, though, that I run the winery side of the operation. My brothers would be very upset if they were tuning in, because I have 3 amazing brothers that they were the good boys. I'm the black sheep who figured the grass has got to be greener on the other side of the fence. But all my brothers run the vineyard operations, and interestingly enough, we do run it as 2 totally separate operations. I buy all my fruit from my family, so it is estate fruit, but there's no family discounts. So we have a saying in the family: when I don't tell them how to grow grapes and they don't tell me how to make wine, we actually get along pretty well.
Well, that's cool. I like that arrangement. It's kind of like a cartel. They know they're going to get the grape orders from you at the winery.
Yeah, I realized a long time ago that the better wines that we make and the more demand that we create, the more expensive the grapes get.
They're
My
like, wait a
brothers
minute.
have capitalized on that. And, trust me when I say our grapes have never been in higher demand, which is a really positive thing for our family overall. But it is, it does kind of somewhat sometimes disincentivize you to work your tail off.
Have you ever had that conversation where one of your brothers calls you and says, "You're charging this for the Cabernet?"
Oh, it is a daily occurrence. And the response is that I think more often than not, I'm saying, you want to charge me what for a ton of grapes? And then their response is, well, we see what you're charging for a bottle of wine. So
Oh man,
they're smart guys, and they know the ins and outs of the business.
now I'm gonna push you back a little bit. I said you were the winery founder, but I didn't say you actually run or in charge of the vineyards. You're just part of the sixth generation of the family that started the vineyards.
Exactly. So my great grandfather, many years ago, homesteaded our first piece of property, started growing grapes. We have continued that tradition of grape growing, but we had never made our own wines. We'd always sold our grapes to other wineries. And my brothers and I like to joke that our childhood was more reminiscent of an indentured servitude than a normal childhood. And I'm pretty sure my parents, believed strongly that the more kids they had, the cheaper the labor force was. And so I grew up working in the vineyards against my will. If we weren't playing sports or in school, we were working in the vineyards, and it's no coincidence that me and all my brothers all played, Division I college sports, because we would do anything in high school to get out of working in the vineyards. So we played every sport available. But I really did. I broke the mold and went in a different direction when I decided to start the winery. And part of it was out of opportunity. We are fortunate, incredibly blessed to own some of the greatest vineyards in Sonoma County. But it was also out of a threat. In the mid 1990s, there was a lot of consolidation, which has continued today in the wine industry. But back then, we had no idea what commoditization, consolidation, corporatization meant as it relates to the wine business. And that was really the threat that spurred my parents to agree to my crazy idea for us to start making our own wine.
And so it was in the 90s where after 130 something years of your family owning the vineyards in this incredibly beautiful part of the world behind me, that you guys started the winery to essentially diversify the business and kind of hedge against the threats in the wine industry of consolidation and corporatization.
Exactly. And, I'm sure we'll touch on it today, but, one of the things that's scary about corporatization, which leads to commoditization, is that what makes wine so special is that every single bottle has a date and a place on it. And that's all a great wine should ever be, is a perfect representation of those two things, and not perfect in a 100-point score sense, but perfect in, if you're going to make a single vineyard wine from a finite area like the beautiful vineyard behind you in Rockpile, then it should be a perfect representation of that. But when corporations get involved, they want it to be like McDonald's. They want it to taste like a Big Mac, no matter where in the world you're at. And that is the antithesis of what wine is about. Wine prides itself on diversification of place and of vintage. And so that's what we looked at as a grower that was raising premium wine grapes and selling to some of the best wineries in California, that if we want to protect, our legacy, we need to make sure that wineries stay focused on that diversification, on that unique characteristic of our vineyard sites. And what better way to do that than to actually put those incredible products in our own bottle?
I that prompts me to share my screen and put this picture of your vineyard up. If anybody's doubting the authenticity of the grapes and the source materials for the wine and the process that you just described of really keeping the quality in a localized way, look at this picture. Like what are we looking at here? Clay?
So this is one of our blocks in our Madrone Spring Vineyard in Rockpile. And what I love about this picture is it illustrates one of the incredibly unique characteristics of Rockpile, and that is the inversion layer. In the original picture in your background, you see one arm of Lake Sonoma behind you, but what you can't tell is that Lake Sonoma is shaped just like a horseshoe, and it's a fairly large body of water. It's about 2,500 surface acres, but more importantly, it's 250 feet deep. And when you have deep water, you have cold water. And because of our proximity to the coast in both Dry Creek and the Rockpile region, we get a lot of fog in the area. But as that fog boils over from the coast and hits the lake, it creates an inversion layer, and the lake sucks that fog down. And that's what you're seeing right here is above 800 feet in the Rockpile appellation, there is absolutely no fog during the growing season. And here's a fun, factoid for all you, wine geeks listening in. Rockpile is one of only 5 AVAs in America that is delineated by elevation as well as geographic boundary. And in our case, in Rockpile, the reason that 800 feet is the elevation mark is because there's no fog above 800 feet. And when you think about the effects on grape growing, we have this moderate climate because of our proximity to the coast and this amazing body of water that cools things down. We have, all the attributes that come along with a hillside vineyard. You've got drainage, sun exposure, wind exposure, soil diversity, but we have no moisture in the form of fog. And as we like to say, it's almost like cheating getting to grow grapes in Rockpile.
Yeah, I want to put up another image here of where the vineyard is above the fog again, and it's this one.
Isn't that amazing?
Well, you're not kidding. The fog's over there, and it ain't coming up this high.
Nope. And this picture actually illustrates it even better, because what we're looking at is we're looking west in this picture, directly west, and you're looking at the coastal range. So the fog is coming over the top of the coastal range, and it's sitting up high, enveloping those ridge tops. But when it gets to the lake, it gets sucked down. And on that one ridge, it doesn't rise because of that inversion layer created by the cold water. So it is, I try and stay away from superlatives like best or better, because we all know that beauty's in the eye of the beholder in many aspects of life, and certainly that's true with wine. But I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that wines grown in the Rockpile AVA have an incredibly distinctive characteristic that you just don't find anywhere else. And that's what makes it special. That's why we put a date and a place on it.
No, that's so cool. And I'm going to put up one more shot here in the background. I want everybody to see it without me in front of it. But this aerial shot is dramatic, and it's the one in my background. But I'm going to put it up without me. That's the Lake Sonoma, yeah, in the background.
That's what we refer to as the Warm Springs arm of Lake Sonoma. So again, think of it like a horseshoe. So you're looking at one side of the horseshoe. And truthfully, this is the smaller side of the horseshoe, but it happens to be the western edge of the lake. And so we get the fog rolling over from those hills you're looking at right there. And it's just unbelievable. You feel like you're, on a desert island, because everywhere you look around you, there's fog except on the ridge you're standing on. And it has to do with that body of water. And, as we were talking about earlier, talk about, making lemonade out of lemons. Most of the body of water used to be my family's. It was part of our original homestead and land that we had purchased over the years. But in 1968, we lost 3,300 acres of our property to eminent domain so that the Army Corps of Engineers could build Lake Sonoma. And at the time, devastating doesn't even begin to describe it. We lost everything, but little did we know that this man-made lake would create one of the most unique grape growing regions in all of the United States. And again, I'll stay away from superlatives, but we'll let you folks out there decide just how incredible these wines are. And I think the track record and scores, help speak to that.
So let me get this straight. In 1968, the federal government called up and said, "Hey, Morrisons, we're going to dam this thing up here. So we're going to take 3,000 acres from you."
Pretty much. We, like eminent domain, we were paid for the land, but also like eminent domain of that time, the land was devalued to the point it's almost comical. I mean, it's almost unbelievable. We were paid 9 cents on the dollar. So in real world times, the land was appraised at $1,300 an acre, and we got paid $110 an acre. Now, to really put it in perspective, with what we were quote unquote paid, what my family could afford to buy was a house in Hillsburg and 90 acres of prunes in Alexander Valley. But put that in perspective to what we lost: 300 acres of vineyard, 200 acres of land that we were farming that at that time was primarily row crops. We had 1,000 head of livestock on the property, primarily sheep, but some cattle. We had my grandparents' home, my great-grandparents' home, and all the improvements it took to raise those crops. And yet, what we could afford with what we were paid was a house in Hillsburg and 90 acres of prunes in Alexander Valley. And, you know, everything in life happens for a reason. I wouldn't be sitting here today if that hadn't happened. And, you know, there's no use crying over spilt milk. But it is a defining characteristic in our family history. And I think it really underscores our commitment to farming and just who we are as a family.
Nah, it's so interesting. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, what's cool is it kind of has a happy ending, but it had to be just traumatic, you know.
Yeah, I wasn't around, so I listened to my dad and grandfather, you know, talk about it, and I remember as a very young boy when the government, in all of their infinite kindness, agreed to lease the land back to us after they had basically stole it from us, and we going up there as a young boy before the lake was in, meaning like before the dam had finished construction, so the lake hadn't formed yet. And just listening to my dad tell stories of some of these areas that are now under 200 feet of water, and it's it's a lot of heartache in there.
Yeah, no, super interesting. So we're going to get into the wines momentarily. I do have to ask you though, because we talked about this the other day, and I thought your comments on it were very interesting. What's it like being next door neighbors to the Gallo winery?
You know, they are wonderful neighbors. They're a wonderful family. They really are. I often reminisce on the fact that here you have the largest winery in the United States that is family owned, 100% family owned, but they have incredible resources. And, you know, their home base was down in the central, you know, valley in Modesto. And when they wanted to make their move to the North Coast, with their resources, they could have gone anywhere. They could have gone to Napa, they could have gone to Mendocino, but they chose to come to Sonoma. And I think it speaks volumes about what an incredible place Sonoma County is. And more importantly, they chose Dry Creek Valley. You know, they are literally our next door neighbors. And, you know, both of the current generation that is running, you know, the empire, Gina and Matt have put down roots here. Matt lives, you know, right up the street from us. And they're wonderful people. They do an unbelievable job farming. You know, they have the resources to spend money on research and development that most wineries don't. And so a lot of the advancements in viticulture are coming out of what Gallo is doing. And for example, you know, with all the challenges that people are having these days with labor and global warming and all these things, they're the ones who are really spending the time and energy researching, you know, how can we address labor deficiencies, you know, through automation or mechanization in the vineyard? How can we address global warming, you know, by using different trellising techniques, different varietals? You know, they're at the cutting edge of research on those things. So, you know, we're thankful to have them here in the valley. We're thankful to have them as neighbors.
Well, it's very cool to hear because, I mean, you have it's a privately owned, but it's a very large corporation. And it's sort of ironic that, you know, you guys as a family made strategic moves to kind of counteract how corporatization and consolidation in the industry would affect you. And yet this giant company next to you is a great neighbor and a really good citizen of the wine industry.
Yeah, and you know, I think you know, you can be multifaceted, and you know, we make a different style of wines than they make, and you know, all great brands, you know, own their identity. You know, you can't be a jack of all trades. You should be a master of one. And we often say that, you know, these big brands and maybe even corporate brands are really critical to the wine industry because they provide that gateway drug, that gateway wine that hooks people and gets them into the industry and
Yeah.
has them ultimately drinking fermented grape juice. But the reason that that was not good for our family had to do with our premium vineyard holdings. So it doesn't mean that there's not a place and that those organizations aren't important in the industry in general. It just means it wasn't a good fit for us to, go down that path of being obligated to sell grapes to large corporations when we could start making our own.
Yeah, no, super interesting. All right, so we have a couple of questions. First of all, I want to shout out a few people who I know who are watching. Myra from Pennsylvania, Nancy from Long Island, Jeffrey and Lisa from North Carolina. It's great to see you guys and everyone else who's watching. Couple of questions, Clay. Was your family the only ones who lost property due to the eminent domain at the time of the federal government coming in and damming up the valley?
Great question. And no, we were not. And this is a great illustration of the term that ignorance is not bliss. I say this, just matter of factly, not pridefully, because it's kind of sad, I guess, in some ways, that I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. We were by and large uneducated farmers who lived off the land. And unfortunately, the lack of education allowed for us to be taken advantage of. There were other landowners that lost property to eminent domain, but let's just say they negotiated much better deals. And there was essentially a one size fits all. They were only offering one price for the land to the other people, but other things that, unbeknownst to us, that were available were land swaps. One of the people that lost property eminent domain was able to swap that property for some other very valuable property. Another one of the families took tax credits, which you can imagine, how that translates into value. And it's funny, one time I asked my grandfather about, the choices that they made and how come he didn't take a tax credit. And he said, son, you need to be making money to use the tax credit. We never made money in our lives. So it's very poignant. I mean, kind of, so no, we were not the only family that lost property to eminent domain. We just lost almost all of our property, where some of the other people that lost property lost smaller chunks. And the reason that that happened to us is we owned that basically ridge line down the middle of the lake. So it was just,
Yeah.
luckily.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. The other question Myra is asking, were you impacted by the fires this year?
Yes, unfortunately we were. In 17 and 19, I say we were relatively lucky because the fires were either east or south of us. And the important thing to note is that in 17 and 19, the fires occurred much later in the growing season. In 2020, there were two major fires. I should say, actually, there were a lot more than two major fires, but two fires that had dramatic impacts on Northern California. And the first was what they called the LNU complex. So that was the lightning complex fires, which at one time there was 364 fires burning in California that were all sparked by a lightning storm that we had. And the main fire that was burning in Sonoma County was unfortunately directly to the west of us. So it was about 1 mile from the winery, but even more impactfully, that beautiful background behind Sam, everything on the other side of the lake was burned very severely. And so you can see in proximity how close that was to our vineyard source. So while we were very fortunate that none of our property was directly affected, we didn't lose any structures, we didn't have any property damage, we lost about 70% of our grape crop to the smoke damage. And,
70 as in 70.
70% of our crop we lost due to smoke damage. And, it is what it is. I mean, we have moved on from it. We are trying to figure out what that means for our brand, in the next 24 months as we would get into the release cycle of our 20 reds. But, the truth is we'll survive. We're going to take our lumps, but we have such a strong commitment to quality that we would never put something in the bottle that we didn't have 100% faith that it was going to be a product that we were proud of. And, there's a lot that's unknown about quote unquote smoke taint and the influence of smoke, but we chose to take a very analytical, objective approach to our vineyards in 2020 and what did and didn't show up for smoke tanks in the analysis that we could run. And if a vineyard had smoke tank, we didn't use it. So fortunately, the reds that we have from 2020 are beautiful. It was such a great growing season, and all of our whites came out great. So our Sauvignon Blanc and our Chardonnay were harvested before the fire. So at least we have those, but we were hit pretty hard with our red wines.
Awesome. I think Susan has a question. Let me see here. Bear with me 1 second. Susan, we can hear you if you can speak your question. Susan, are you there? No? Maybe not. All right, we'll come back to that. Just hit us in the chat, Susan, if you would. All right, so I want to show one more picture and then let's get tasting.
Let's do that.
So I'm going to put in my background here. I just love these. The facility is beautiful. What are these? I've never seen vessels like this. Are these barrels?
This is what we would refer to as foudre or oak fermentation tanks. So to give you some perspective, it's kind of hard to tell from this picture. A traditional barrel is approximately 60 gallons, so either 225 or 228 liters. These tanks behind you are 2,000 gallon tanks. And so, we do not use these for aging like you would use a traditional 60-gallon barrel. These are fermentation tanks. And, a lot of people would ask, well, why would you use these upright oak tanks for fermentation? Why not use the traditional stainless steel that you see on the right of the screen or even concrete? And the simple answer is wood just has very different thermal and oxidative properties than either stainless steel or concrete. Wood does not conduct heat very well, which is another way of saying that it actually is a pretty good insulator. So when we ferment in wood, our fermentation temperature curve looks very different than it would in stainless steel. And basically, fermentations take a long time to heat up and then a long time to cool down. And that completely changes the trajectory of wine. The other obvious characteristic of wood is it's permeable. So it actually, the wood breathes. There's an introduction of oxygen during the fermentation through the wood. And again, that has an impact on, the finished wine. If you're talking about big red wines like Cabernet, which we primarily ferment in the first 3 tanks, it softens the tannins, it pulverizes the tannins, it causes them to bind up in more complex chains. And when we get to the Cabernet, you'll taste that. And then the last tank that you can't really tell any difference from looking at it from this perspective, but one of these tanks is reserved for white wines. And we love to ferment our Sauvignon Blanc in these upright oak tanks because you get all of the advantages I was just talking about, but no actual wood flavor infused. When you talk about the wood characteristics that impact a wine, most of that flavor comes from the toasting process. Upright oak tanks are not toasted. So again, we're just buying them for their different thermal properties and oxidative properties versus, buying them for the actual flavor they impart. And it really, these are the finite differences, in my opinion, that turn a good wine into a great wine.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I will say that that was my question is, does the wood somehow, these are tanks, they're not barrels. So it doesn't give flavor because of the toasting doesn't happen in these. How long do you keep the wine in these tanks? And again, just for Nancy, these are actually tanks, not barrels, even though they're made of wood.
So we typically use them for fermentations, and most of our fermentations last between 10 to 20 days. We do all native yeast here at the winery, so we believe in doing as much as we humanly can to express the vineyard in its natural state, and that includes the native flora and fauna that come in the vineyard. So again, it's somewhere between 14 to 20 days, and during the course of harvest, with the tanks that we're using for red fermentations, we'll probably actually get 3 fermentations in it. And Cabernet is the primarily purpose of purchasing those tanks because they are extremely expensive. So we'll ferment as much Zinfandel in them as we can. But when it starts getting close to Cabernet harvest, the focus goes on all of our Cabernet going into them. So I hope that answers the question. Individual fermentations between 10 to 20 days over the course of the harvest. There'll be wine in there. We'll do 3 fermentations, so somewhere between 30 to 60 days. And the other 300 days out of the year, they sit empty because we only use them for fermentation. And what you can't see from this perspective is that they have 55-inch removable lids on the tanks. So they're not a great storage vessel. They're a great fermentation vessel.
Got it. And it's roughly the same amount of time that you would ferment wine in the regular stainless steel tanks, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
But a lot of wines are stored in stainless after fermentation. Like our Sauvignon Blanc we store it in stainless to preserve, the natural characteristics. But
awesome. All right, well, let's get tasting. I think we're starting with the 2018 Morrison Alexander Valley Chardonnay. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's what I have in my glass right here. So we'll give you an idea of what the bottle looks like, everybody. So if you got some at home or you're going to order some, this is what you're looking at. And fret not, if you go to our website without using the link, a lot of these wines are sold out, but you have a private link, and I can't stress that enough, that Sam can share that is going to get you access to some of these wines. So Chardonnay is kind of a funny story. We're a Dry Creek family. I mentioned earlier that when we lost our property in Rockpile, my ancestors bought, 90 acres of prunes in Alexander Valley, and this is, the fruit of that labor. Alexander Valley is often thought of as Cabernet land, and there's some great Cabernet grown there. But what people forget is that the Russian River runs through the middle of Alexander Valley, and while you're not as close in proximity to the coast to create an inversion layer, you do have a cooling influence, and our vineyard borders the convergence of Sassel Creek and Russian River. And what I love about that for this Chardonnay is I love the alluvial fan. So you're dealing with sedimentary-based soils, closer proximity to the river that you get, the better drainage, the more sand and gravel you're going to have. So this is a really well-drained site. We're obviously going to get some cooling influence from our proximity to the river. And this is just a beautiful Chardonnay site. We're not Russian River. We're not as cool as Russian River. And so while you want to make sure that you're honoring the site, we also do things a little bit different from a winemaking perspective to preserve some of that acid. We pick our Chardonnay at a relatively lower sugar levels so that our alcohols don't get too high. You'll see that the 2018 Chardonnay is below 14%, which is pretty uncommon for California Chardonnays these days. And I'm not a big stickler on alcohol, but we like to preserve the natural fruit characteristics of Chardonnay. And we only use about 10% new oak. Now, this is aged and fermented, or I should say fermented and aged, 100% in French oak, but of those 20 barrels, only 2 of them are new. And again, we're trying to give you a pure expression of the site without slathering the wine in oak. And, when you smell the Chardonnay, if the first flavor profile that comes to your nose is vanilla or brioche or toast, to me, that's not how it should be, because those are flavors that are imparted on the wine from the oak, not the vineyard. I want you to be able to taste the vineyard. I want you to smell some of that green apple and pear and a little bit of the minerality. And if there is a hint of butter or brioche in the background, that's the role that oak should play. It should be a complementary component. So this is, it's without a doubt a new world, wine, but it really pays homage to the roots in Burgundy because you have great acid. And the other thing we do here is we only go through about 50% malolactic conversion. So we're preserving some of that malic acid in the wine to give it a freshness, a brightness. And we're pretty proud of this. And we make a tiny amount. We only make about 300 cases. And in fact, in 2018, I think we made 281 cases.
And by the way, for everybody watching, in the chat, I put the URL that Clay referenced, the special URL that takes you directly to the page where you can get these wines. He is correct. In some parts of the Morrison website, it looks like they're sold out of these. But if you go to that special URL that I put in the chat module of Zoom, you will see them available. What's the retail on this Chardonnay, Clay?
Oh, Sam, I knew you were going to ask me that. You're asking a winemaker, the important questions that I should know. I believe the Chardonnay is 35, but I'm embarrassed to say that, when you wear as many hats as I do, sometimes, I'm not always.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll go to that URL now, and I will. We'll find out momentarily here. But
Yeah, we're both
yeah.
racing to it. So,
Um, what's your favorite food to pair with this wine?
so yeah, that's one of my favorite topics of discussion. I like to think, and Chef Charlie Palmer, who's a dear friend and business partner, and we make some wine together, and you and I were talking about him the other day. Charlie taught me this, that when you're thinking about food and wine pairing, think of it in very simple terms: parallel or perpendicular. And what a parallel food pairing would be is if you have a really creamy Chardonnay to pair it with a creamy dish. A perpendicular food pairing would be if you have a creamy Chardonnay, pair it with something light and acidic. So our Chardonnay tends to be more on the acidic side. And so I actually love the thought of doing a perpendicular pairing and pairing this with some type of white sauce, and whether that be, an Alfredo sauce or, clams Alfredo, something like that, because the acid in the Chardonnay is going to cut through, that cream base beautifully. I love this Chardonnay with seafood, and people tend to think about oysters and Sauvignon Blanc, which is true, but to me, like a clam or a mussel has a little bit more flavor to it, and so a little bit more powerful. And I love our Chardonnay with that. And generally white fish and Chardonnay tend to be a good pairing. We drank this on Thanksgiving, so white meats and Chardonnay go well as well.
Yeah, and I think the seafood, a lobster with this. I mean, a Chardonnay like this that's got that nice, it retains the acidity, is almost like a squirt of lemon that going on that seafood.
I'll tell you probably this is my sneaker pick for the evening. One of my all-time favorite Chardonnay pairings is fried chicken and Chardonnay. I mean, it is, again, especially this Chardonnay, because you're really looking at that perpendicular pairing. You think it's a parallel, but the fat, in a fried chicken and the acid in the Chardonnay, it cuts right through it, and you almost have the best of both worlds. You have the parallel and the perpendicular, and especially if you're using a light flaky crust like a panko crust, with a little bit of flavoring in your breading. I mean, it's really an outstanding pairing.
And I put, just so everybody has it on our screen now, is that's the page from the URL I put in the chat. I like this Chardonnay also, Clay, with like a really creamy triple creme brie cheese.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. All right. So up next is the 2018 Mauritson Dry Creek Valley Zinfandel. And I happen to notice, no pressure, Clay, but Becky from Zap is watching right now. So
all right.
You're the spotlight is on.
I welcome the spotlight. As a former athlete, the spotlight. I work well under pressure.
Excellent. So obviously Zinfandel is big in the region. It's big for your winery. So talk a little bit about this wine.
So one of the most common questions I get is, what is your favorite wine? And my common response to that is, that's a nearly impossible question to answer, because depending on the moment, I may feel like a specific wine. An easy question for me to answer is what my favorite varietal is. And there is absolutely no doubt that Zinfandel is my favorite varietal. And I think it actually stems from not only our history here in Dry Creek Valley, but my insanely competitive nature. I don't care what producer has tried to tell you that Pinot Noir is the most difficult wine to make. If they say that, they simply have never made Zinfandel. I say this with the greatest love, that Zinfandel, it's a bastard of a grape. It's big berried, it's thin skinned, it ripens unevenly, it overproduces. There are so many inherent challenges to Zinfandel that when you can make a varietally correct, balanced, structured Zinfandel, it is an infinitely greater accomplishment than doing that with other varietals. And I think a lot of winemakers just pay lip service to the notion that wine's made in the vineyard. You hear that all the time. Oh yeah, wine's made in the vineyard. We take a hands-off approach. Well, if you truly believe in that adage, wouldn't the grape that's the most difficult to grow be the wine the most difficult to make, and therefore the one that we should appreciate the most? And that's what I love about Zinfandel. you know, being born and raised in Dry Creek Valley, it's practically synonymous with Zin. And that's what we grew growing up. That's what my family drank at the dinner table. And so I knew when we started the brand that our brand was going to be focused on Zinfandel. And we make 8 different Zins at the winery. And while our Rockpile wines probably get, you know, I know they get bigger scores and they're in higher demand and more prestige, this is the wine that I hang my hat on. And, you know, not only from the standpoint that we make more of it than any other wine, so it certainly pays the bills around the winery, but there's so much more of an artistic expression with this wine. Our other Zinfandels that we make are all single vineyard wines, where this is a blend of 9 different vineyards throughout Dry Creek Valley. And we have these amazing vineyards available to us. And we have everything from a younger 25-year-old vineyard all the way up to, you know, head pruned, dry farmed 85-year-old, you know, vineyard sources. And so when you can take these unique nuances of all these individual sites and blend them together year after year, you develop something, you know, approach to that blank canvas, if you will. And we also have Petite Sirah at our disposal. So we typically use somewhere in that, you know, 3 to 5% Petite Sirah. This one happened to be 6% Petite Sirah in 2018. But I do love Zinfandel. It is without a doubt my favorite varietal.
All right. So what's the, Jeffrey says Zinfandel rocks. Jeff, I agree with you. You had me at Zinfandel. What are the tasting notes on this one? And because we're going to taste 2 Zins here. So tell us briefly what this one's all about and what would you pair it with?
So 2018 was, you know, a really outstanding growing season in California. The one knock on 2018 is that the crop was fairly large, but we, with my brother's focus on farming, you know, we really drill things down to a pound per vine, you know, basis. So we never have an issue with overcropping. And it was probably my favorite vintage in the last 10 years. And primarily because it was cool. Everyone talks about global warming, which is very real. But 2018 was a relatively cool vintage, even on the 30-year average. So the wines have such beautiful acid. They have this focus to them. And the Dry Creek Zin shows that because instead of having that expected jammy, you know, raisiny, dehydrated fruit characteristic, this has got fresh fruit. And it's, you know, Bing cherry, it's got raspberry, it's got blackberry, and yet there still is that wonderful spice and a little bit of hint, you know, of an herbal note to it. And a lot of people shy away from that, you know, or think that that can be construed as a negative characteristic. And to me, all great wines have to have complexity. They cannot be monochromatic, you know, and just have one singular flavor profile. They have to show that, and that flavor should have brightness to it, freshness to it. And I think that's the defining characteristic of this, is that you have all these fresh fruits, you've got that beautiful black pepper spice, but you still have these wonderful herbal notes to it as well.
All right, so you got 2 Zins here, so you're gonna have to be strategic about the pairing. What's the food for this one?
So this one tends to be, you know, more fruit forward. And so I love Zin with grilled meats. I think Zin is one of the most dynamic, you know, food wines. But I would say with this, stick with something with a sweeter base. So, you know, ribs are probably my all-time favorite thing with our Dry Creek Zinfandel. So I'm going to use more of a Kansas City-based sauce, right? So you're going to have a lot of sugar in your barbecue sauce, maybe a little hint of vinegar, not as much as North Carolina sauce, but, you know, something that you're going to, you know, cook for a long time, and especially over a grill where you're getting that natural smoke with, you know, some barbecue sauce. Where I'll talk about, I'm a meat lover. And so with our Rockpile Zins, that's one of the things I talk about is that, you know, I don't want, you know, barbecue sauce with the Rockpile Zin. I don't want the sweetness in the sauce, but what I do want is I want marbling, because our Rockpile Zins have a lot of tannin and always have great acid. And back to that notion of that perpendicular, you know, wine pairing, I want fat in the meat that Zinfandel acid can cut through, and it just is incredibly harmonious. So we'll talk about the Rockpile Zin characteristics, but you know, they're very different wines. They have very different structural components, different acid levels.
Well, speaking of the Rockpile, I know we got to be mindful, everybody. We're very fortunate to have Clay with us, but he turns into a pumpkin in about 15 minutes. So we're going to move on to the Rockpile right now. And I love doing a comparison of the 2 two same varietal wines, but very different in some ways.
Yeah, and we're narrowing the place, right? Our Dry Creek Zin is a blend of 9 different vineyards all throughout Dry Creek Valley, and now we're talking about a single vineyard Zinfandel from our Rockpile property. We make 700 cases of this wine, so very, very, very small production. And we talked about Rockpile earlier, how unique it is to have that inversion layer and the moderate temperatures. But what does that mean for what you taste in the glass? And what I always say is, in the most basic sense, it means that we have the ability to get physiologic and phenolic ripeness at relatively lower sugar levels, which is a really fancy way of saying we don't have to pick our Rockpile Zinfandel grapes at 27 or 28 bricks, because we get the desired flavor profile at 24 or 25 bricks. And the beauty of that is that acid and sugar are converse relationships. As your sugars rise, your acids drop. So if we can pick at lower sugar levels, we're going to have natural higher acidity in the wines. And, when you taste this, you taste the singularity of sight. You could almost argue that our Dry Creek Zin is more complex, because I'm taking 9 different vineyard sites and blending them together, where this wine has such amazing focus. You literally, when you're tasting this wine, you can imagine standing on top of that ridge, looking at that inversion layer. You taste the slope, in the sense that this wine has so much more tannin to it. We often refer to it as a Cabernet Zinfandel, because it has the texture that most people expect out of the Cabernet. It has unbelievable ageability, yet it has the fruit and flavor profile that people expect out of the Zin.
And so, is this one bigger? Is this one jammier?
Bigger in the sense of tannin, but not bigger. A lot of people, it's a word that gets misused a lot. When what does bigger mean? Does it bigger mean more tannin? Does it mean more alcohol? Does it mean more fruit? Our Zins are all at relatively lower alcohol than I think what you see out there. They're usually in the 14.5% range. So no, it's not bigger in alcohol, but it's much bigger in tannin. We have smaller berries in Rockpile due to the slope and lack of fog. So we have a lower juice to skin ratio. So we have the opportunity for more tannin extraction. And again, when you compare that with the beautiful acids we get because we're picking at lower bricks, you create a very rustic style. And we don't ever want to compare ourselves to anyone else, because we are who we are. But for those of you out there that maybe are more experienced, we're tweaking, wines from the Tuscany region, where you're on the Mediterranean Sea, you have a moderate climate, you have these rustic tannins. That's what Rockpile wines remind me a lot of, is wines from the Mediterranean region, specifically, the super Tuscan wines.
Got it. And so this Zin, the first Zin, Dry Creek, you said Kansas City barbecue. What's your favorite food with this one?
I'm sticking with meat, but I'm going with a well-marbled cut of beef. So I'm thinking ribeye, New York. This is not a wine to pair with a filet. You could do this with a tri-tip. I still like it grilled, but if you took a ribeye and did it in your wonderful cast iron pan and finished it in the oven, this would be absolutely stunning. I also like the fact that this wine does show a little bit more earthiness. So that makes it transition really nicely to gamier dishes, and whether that's duck or lamb, something that shows a little bit more. I'm an avid outdoorsman. I love to hunt. I had a great hunting season. I got some elk in the freezer, and Rockpile Zinfandel with like an elk tenderloin is absolutely beautiful. Now, again, I wouldn't do it with beef tenderloin. That's going to be a little bit richer, but I'll do it with a lean elk tenderloin that has more of a gamey characteristic to it.
I like it. All right. So, Clay, final wine. Rockpile Ridge Vineyard Cabernet.
Yes, sir. So I talked earlier about how Zinfandel is my favorite varietal, always has been, always will be. And I'm going to sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but you got to follow me here. Cabernet is the wine I like to blend the most. And to me, Zinfandel, there's not a lot of margin for error, as I mentioned earlier. Especially making single vineyard wines, it really has to be perfect. But one of the great things about Cabernet is it plays nicely with others. There are 5 red Bordeaux varietals for a reason, and it will never cease to amaze me what blending a little bit of Cabernet Franc or Malbec or Merlot into Cabernet, how that will forever change the trajectory of the wine, the flavor profile, the tannin profile, the texture. And so Rockpile is such an incredible place to grow Bordeaux varietals for all of the reasons we've already talked about. But I love the artistry in this wine. And it's different than the artistry in the Dry Creek Zin, where we're blending 9 different Zinfandel vineyards. We grow all 5 Bordeaux varietals in Rockpile. So it's more like giving an artist a blank canvas, and instead of giving them one color of paint to work with, giving them 5 different colors of paint. And I love this wine. And I will say that one of the amazing things about Rockpile is even across varietals, there is that common vein of structure and acid. And so while I said earlier that the Rockpile Zin reminds me of the Tuscany region of Italy, you're going to find that same vein with the Cabernet. You're going to get that rustic tannin, that iron minerality. It's a common vein of across varietals. And I think it's a true hallmark of a really exceptional, unique grape growing region, that you can pick that region out, even if you're talking about different varietals.
Yeah, and I think it's worth restating that your focus and your real claim to distinction as a winery is the wines you make out of the Rockpile AVA.
Yes, sir. That is, we've been farming that piece of property for 152 years and 7 generations, and there's nothing that makes us prouder of, our heritage, the fact that we've been able to sustain ourselves from that piece of property, and it is without a doubt our claim to fame. And again, we're limited by very small vineyards up there, so this is a perfect example where we only made 392 cases, of this Cabernet. So it is truly outstanding. One of the better scoring cabs in Sonoma County on a historical basis, and we're really proud of it.
What's your pairing recommendation here for food?
So Cabernet with a little bit more acid, I think you can do more with it. I like to think of back to my comment about richer foods. So if you love filet, this is a great wine for it. I also like braised meats with this. So anything that you're going to cook in the old, crock pot, or you're going to put, if you're thinking about a lamb shank, or you're making, everyone hates it when I say this because it's such a traditional Burgundian dish, but why am I drawing a blank on it? What is the famous dish they do in Burgundy? Anyways, if you're going to braise meats and then slow cook them in a stew type of environment,
Are you thinking cassoulet?
Not cassoulet. Beef bourguignon.
Beef bourguignon.
Yeah, which again, most people think of that with Pinot. I love a Cabernet like this with beef bourguignon. I love the richness, the complexity that comes with. No different. It's not much different than blending, right? There's a reason that we use carrots and onions and celery as bases for great stocks. It's that combination of flavors, and then you take the combination of Cabernet with Malbec and Merlot and Cabernet Franc in it, and I love that pairing. So richer cuts of beef with this, and braised low cooked meats.
All right, so now Clay has not been prepared for this, and I'm gonna pop a question on you here, Clay. This is a little bit of a surprise, but I've got somebody that I want to put on the screen, and I want to ask you what this person would pair with the Cabernet.
I was not prepared for that.
So this is Charlie Palmer, everybody, the famous award-winning chef, restaurants around the world. And Clay and the Morrison folks are pretty modest, but these are the kinds of culinary personalities and people that they rub elbows with and are good friends with. So Charlie well, Clay. What would Charlie pair with the Cabernet?
I think Charlie would agree with the braised comment. He would probably get a lot more complex than I would. I'd say he'd look at something like a braised lamb shank, maybe go with a more traditional pairing as well as a prime rib. Charlie, actually his prime rib recipe that we cook every holiday is one of the best I've ever had. And when you rub it with different herbs, again, and slow cook it, that's one of the telltale signs of what pairs well with Cabernet is slow cooked meats. So that's what Charlie would say. And Charlie is a dear friend, huge supporter of philanthropic efforts that my wife and I are involved in. And we've been making wine together now for 15 years, and it's just an honor to get to work with him.
Well, that's so cool. And I think, just having that kind of a leading light in culinary, who's a fan of the winery is a huge validation and endorsement of what you do. I learned something tonight, which is slow cooked meats with a finesse Cabernet Sauvignon like this.
Try it. You will not be disappointed.
Yeah. No, that's big. Well, everybody, is there any other questions or comments that we have for Clay? He's got to rush off to another commitment. I think you have a board meeting with one of the charities you're involved with.
I do. You're exactly right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put my email in the chat, and that way, when I have to log off, please, everyone out there, copy my email. Send me any questions that you may have. I believe in the wonderful fourth grade adage that there's no such thing as a stupid question, and we love to communicate, with our guests and with our supporters. And Sam, I just can't thank you again for having me. It's been an honor to do this with you in New York Wine Experiences, and I look forward to doing much more together.
Absolutely, we were thrilled to get you on tonight, and it's so cool to learn about the winery and so many interesting bits of information about your AVA, your area, and the wines themselves. I know a bunch of people have been saying in the chat that they're looking forward to enjoying the wine. So, and by the way, this is the first time all year long, people, 50-something broadcasts that the winemaker has put his email into the chat. So kudos to you, Clay.
Send it to me. All right, Sam, I got to go. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. It's really been a pleasure, and I look forward to getting you out here, Sam, out to Rockpile, and I look forward to when
we're going to go fishing in the lake, because you've never been fishing in the lake. So that's
we'll do that. We'll do that.
All right. Have fun, guys. Take care now. Bye-bye.